what we're doing is talking about both like social liberation and spiritual ultimate liberation, right? And we're
Yes.
trying to find the intersection of both of those liberations, like in this moment, right? And
Right.
so it may seem really challenging to folks who are just centered in social liberation, right? And it's also going to seem challenging to people who are just centered in ultimate spiritual liberation, right? But we're trying to bring both of these liberations together to understand how we can live liberated in the world, right? And to weave together the kind of freedom, that we really want to see.
Under the master's will, years and years of hurting each other, we gotta turn it all around, turn it all around. No way, no way, no way.
Welcome to the Spirit Underground podcast with Dharma teachers Spring Washam and Lama Rod Owens. These conversations will explore how we can heal with plant-based medicine and indigenous wisdom, integrate Buddhist-based meditation practices, and reconnect to our ancestral knowledge. Together, we will explore what freedom means individually, collectively, and spiritually. If you would like to support the Spirit Underground podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/donate. All right, family, here we are back again with our podcast, Spirit Underground with Spring Washam.
And I'm Lama Rod.
Here we are. We're back to talk all things liberation.
Yes.
Conversations on liberation. These are our favorite conversations. I feel like I want to talk about this all the time.
Yeah. It just crossed my mind to emphasize this because I feel like I'm always having to say this these days. But what we're doing is talking about both like social liberation and spiritual ultimate liberation, right? And we're
Yes.
trying to find the intersection of both of those liberations, like in this moment, right? And
Right.
so it may seem really challenging to folks who are just centered in social liberation, right? And it's also going to seem challenging to people who are just centered in ultimate spiritual liberation, right? But we're trying to bring both of these liberations together to understand how we can live liberated in the world, right? And to weave together the kind of freedom, that we really want to see, knowing that this world, like this relative world, will never be as free as we want it to be, because this is the realm of suffering. Like this is just, this is not our home, right? As our ancestors would sing and preach about, like this world is not our home, right? And there was another home for us, as Harriet Tubman said at the very end of her life as she was passing on, I am leaving to prepare a home, a place for you, right?
Yes.
So this is like, so we're coming from both of these spaces, right?
So how do we be at home knowing it's not our home, where everyone's seeking, the word safety? Like, I need a safe home. I need a safe home. But I'm wondering, could this ever be safe in this place? It's samsara. And it has characteristics that are beyond what we want.
Yeah. I mean, I call samsara the carceral state, right? And in my work around spiritual abolition, so I can never be safe in this realm because this isn't my most authentic expression, So there's always going to be pain, right? There'll always be situations of suffering. I'm always going to be struggling to gather the resources that I need to be well. Ultimately, I will have to die, right? And that's really the proof that this isn't my home. Like, my true home is an experience where I don't have to transition out of, you know?
So it's more consciousness. It's not a destination. It's a
Yeah,
being,
it
right? It's a
is.
fluidity. It's not
Yeah,
a state.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And that, of course, I think both spiritual liberation and social liberation both have a whole bunch of challenges and requires a lot of labor. When you bring both of those together, there's even more labor. And it's a nuance and a complexity that takes a lot of energy and practice, like, to move through.
Yeah, you're kind of taking on a double heaping. You're
Yeah,
saying, I'm gonna liberate
yeah,
myself. That's
yeah,
full-time work.
yeah,
But no, now I'm gonna turn it outward. I mean, we're always doing both. Healing myself
right.
is healing. But there's some of us that take on a bigger piece
Yeah,
for the collective. We move with the
yes,
collective in mind. We
yeah,
work toward um, embracing and serving the
yeah,
collective in a different
yeah,
way.
yeah,
So that's like, it's a double. You got two heapings to tend to,
yeah. And like
two
everything,
scoops.
yeah, and everything that we do is for the collective, right? Like, we're doing labor for the collective in ways that most people don't even recognize, right? In the same way, like, I have teachers who are doing labor for me and the communities that I belong to that we don't even recognize, we don't even register, right? Because this labor is happening, really on a level of consciousness that we're not aware of or we're not attuned to, but they're working, like, to free us, like,
Mhm.
from the causes and
Mhm.
conditions of suffering, right?
And this is so, I think, so interesting as we were going to talk about this topic
Hmm.
of what is the spirit underground,
Yeah.
which we keep talking about all the ancestors
Hmm.
that labored on behalf
Hmm.
of all beings, right?
Yeah.
They did this work of freedom. Harriet, oh my
Hmm.
God,
Hmm.
labored on behalf of
Right.
all, from the Underground
Hmm.
Railroad as the conductor archetype as she was, and then
Yeah.
the soldier,
Hmm.
and then the women's rights, freedom fighter,
Yeah.
women's liberation. Her whole
Hmm.
world view was that,
Hmm.
right? But yet had this
Hmm.
internal dialogue with spirit the whole time.
Hmm.
So there was something really interesting about what we're talking about, this inner and outer. And I thought it would
Yeah.
be good to share about, because I think that's really what the spirit underground is, right? Where we have
Hmm.
this flow, this connection,
Yeah.
and it's like internal, but then we're moving
Hmm.
externally as these conductors, right? Our
Hmm.
movements in the world, we're conducting
Hmm.
um, our channels of freedom, our words, our
Yeah.
actions, our practices, our
Hmm.
community gatherings.
Hmm.
So let's break down more
Hmm.
about this as we get into
Yeah.
this topic, because that's what our podcast was really inspired by, right? The
Right.
Spirit Underground, this movement.
Yeah.
Um, so you can say, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. And then I'll say kind of more that came out through writing my book
Right.
about Harriet Tubman,
Yeah.
and maybe share a piece about that.
I mean, really, like, what I would share is when this phrase of the spirit underground really dropped right
Mm,
into my consciousness and awareness, right? And this was during quarantine, when I had received a large frame picture of Mother Harriet, at the end of her life, when, it's a very famous picture. She's dressed all in white, she's, much older, and she's sitting in a rocking chair outside. So I was offered that picture. I brought it into my house, and just the heaviness of the energy in my home just really, like, it just really intensified. And I was like, what is this? you know,
right.
and I was offered, a hoodie along with that picture with her, of course, with her image, her picture on the hoodie. It was a really nice hoodie. It was a really nice hoodie. I was like, oh, I want to wear it, right? And I couldn't quite put it on. Like every time I would attempt to put it on, I would just feel really like overwhelmed. Right? I'm just like, I don't know what's going on here. So, I just ignored it. And so just one day I was like, I can't keep, living here with this energy. It just felt like I was living underwater, like the pressure was so intense. And so finally I just went and I just kind of like kneeled in front of the picture. I was like, okay, what?
Exactly.
Like what? I just kind of opened up, in the way like, we do when we begin to channel energies. I just found myself opening, getting spacious, and allowing space for these messages to arise. And I just connected instantly to Mother Harriet, and she was like, listen, you can wear the hoodie, but you have to promise to commit to this work of liberation, and I was like, yeah, I think I'm already committed, but yeah, sure. She was like, my liberation work. And I was like, yeah. It's like, it was never a second doubt. Of course, I'm with you in this liberation work. Right. And then she started then this phrase, Spirit Underground. And she was like, well, you have to be involved with the Spirit Underground. And I was like, oh, what's that? And that was it. And the only thing that I got was about organizing. Like, you just have to organize the Spirit Underground. And that's all I got. And then energy lifted from the house. I put on the hoodie, wore it all the time. And that was it. And then I told you, about this
Exactly.
Spirit Underground. And I told like one other person, a good sister friend, about it. And she was helping me to discern what that message was, But like I just got the Spirit Underground. I was like, okay, I'll just wait for further instructions.
I know it was when you told me about it, immediately you created language for something that I was trying to name that was happening, and as soon as you said it, I was like, right, that is the name of this experience of what is happening through Harriet. And that's what I was getting through the book, through writing about these parallel realities, the Underground Railroad being this physical place of stops, and they're historical markers right now of the Underground Railroad that existed and for 60 years. And but as I was writing the book and channeling Harriet, it's like, no, there's a whole nother one. There's a whole nother railroad with hundreds of stops and moves through light and space. And I had written that whole chapter in my book. And when you said it's the Spirit Underground, I was like, oh, I felt like, through both of us, she was giving us peace. She gave the language because I kept calling it the light rail. Oh, this is
I
like the light
remember.
underground light rail.
Yeah.
But that never really fit, right? And then when you said Spirit Underground, I was like, oh, I think this is what they call themselves.
Yeah.
I didn't. Themselves.
Yeah. Because that's all I got. I was like, Spirit Underground. I don't know what that's pointing to or who this is about, but then I just gave it to you.
And then we were really, there was something so alive in that, though.
Yeah.
Those two words together describe something really powerful, actually. And then once I started writing about that experience in these conversations, and Harriet would share what was happening and how it was happening and the movement of it's like, moving up, changing from one level to another, going through one level of consciousness to another, and being able to access this railroad, this light road with all these agents and spirits and our ancestors and to be able to get on, to become a passenger. You know, and I feel like Harriet's definitely one of the main conductors on that. I think there's others, but I think somehow Harriet has orchestrated that somehow, or kind of oversees that, takes that responsibility. And I write about that in the book. She's sort of a monitor of these tracks.
Yeah.
She watches this light rail, this spirit underground highway through consciousness. And it's deep. And, you know, we've had a lot of magic around this too.
Yeah. And this is the being who manifests as this historical figure we knew as Harriet Tubman. You know, Harriet Tubman doesn't exist, you know,
Right.
like in the ultimate sense. Like Harriet Tubman is an expression of an awakened consciousness.
Absolutely.
Right? That takes on a form that can best relate to the beings that they're working with, right?
Yeah. I mean, Harriet, you know, obviously was nicknamed Moses. Almost our entire life had that nickname that came as an underground agent name from a famous abolitionist, gave her that name. But then all of the people said that is Moses. And so rather we call it an emanation, they took on those qualities. You know, we needed Moses. All the people, all they knew was the story of Moses. They were crying out. 4 million people in chains, and Harriet tumbled out of heaven in response, as an energetic response to that. So, and now there's another whole level to Harriet Tubman. And I feel like she's talking to people around. I was just telling you the story about my other friend who was over here and had a dream and then made this little video trying to describe what he was seeing, like the bear and then this, and then Harriet was flying and was wearing that. It was that picture, was flying around.
And I've been teaching the practice of the spirit underground, connecting people to that frequency, because, you know, it's a frequency of energy that we're connecting to. And so many people started having downloads, you know, from Harriet and from the spirit underground, right? You know, and the spirit underground, you know, I was telling you before, like the spirit underground for me is like equivalent to a Buddhist Pure Land. You know, well, it is a Pure Land. It's not equivalent. It is a Pure Land. Like, and a Pure Land is an energetic realm that we can attune, you know, to in order for our consciousness to be kind of drawn into that energetic space, right? And this is why we do practice, right? Because we're trying to attune to different frequencies of energy that are connected to higher consciousness, to light, you know, to liberation, to love, compassion, what have you, right? And then when we die, our consciousness is drawn to these energetic realms, these frequencies that we've trained to connect to, where we will continue to connect more and more to, you know, the clarity and wisdom of our consciousness instead of the delusion, which is another frequency that keeps us cycling through samsara, or the carceral state. So
there's whole realms of delusion. You can take birth in and have the eons there if you know, stay like that.
So the world that we're functioning in is a lower frequency, right? And we're training to connect to higher frequencies. And so Harriet Tubman, along with the other conductors, right, have established this energetic realm with a higher frequency that's focused on reflecting a culture and labor of social liberation, right? So it's like this pure realm reflects the work of liberation work and culture here in this world, right? So it's the people who are working for freedom, who believe in freedom, who are attuning to authentic states of liberation, who are therefore being drawn called into the spirit underground.
Yeah, and it feels like a lot of these spirits are so active in consciousness right now. We're seeing their images everywhere. We're seeing, it seems like they're getting louder as this sort of feels like this pure land is growing, or at least a certain amount of us, there's a critical mass that can now connect to it, right? Isn't that it? Because Harriet said, when I was alive, this wasn't an option. I needed people to get physically liberated. I couldn't do much with their minds.
Yeah, exactly.
I just needed to get them out of literal chains.
Yeah.
That was the promised land, out of the system of abolishing slavery. That was where we got, But now there's this, it feels like this pure land place, this consciousness. So many of us can hear it. We're available for that. In a way, it feels like we weren't a couple years ago. There has been something in the last 2 years, all of this difficulty and turmoil and illnesses and viruses and has created a kind of crack in the matrix. I feel like it keeps cracking, right? And then we're seeing up into the sky in a new way. We're seeing our minds, we're opening. So it's really weird, even though it feels like we're in a state of contraction and more suffering, but there's actually a window, a road that is expanding at the same time.
Exactly. And I know there's, people always have this kind of criticism and feedback around the ways in which these beings are reemerging in the culture, right?
Right.
And then people say, "Oh, we're manipulating, the memory of Harriet Tubman, or she wouldn't agree to be on a $20
she didn't
bill.
say that, or she didn't do that."
Yeah, she didn't say that or do that. She didn't want this movie done.
She hates it.
She hates it. Like, why do we have, a British actress playing Harriet Tubman, Cynthia Erivo, who's amazing, right?
Right.
Like all this criticism, and like for me on our end, like we're like, well, Harriet's like actually doing this. Like she's actually triggering. Like this is like she's orchestrating this. Like people aren't randomly saying, "Oh, we need Harriet Tubman back in the culture." I'm like, no, Harriet Tubman is back touching this realm energetically in a lot of people's minds and consciousness, right? And she's getting people to reintroduce her, right?
Yes.
I remember in the same way back in the 90s with Malcolm X, when Malcolm X was like reemerging again in the 90s, and looking back and I'm like, oh, that's Malcolm X. Like that's him coming back, and someone like Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., he has been so present after all these decades because his consciousness was so powerful, right? That he was this really powerful, he is this really powerful being, who emanated as Dr. King into this world, right? To work for, liberation, and opening up to love and compassion and this dream, of this beloved community. And some people listening to this will be like, well, Dr. King, blah, blah, blah. But like, this is the skillful means of awakened beings.
Yeah, they can appear. Yeah. And they often appear in lineages and they pick off, right, where one left. It's like a new emanation, right? It reminds me of like the 17th Karmapa, right? They like keep coming back in these, they can shape shift and.
Yeah. And who do I need to be? That's the question.
Yeah. What do I need to do to serve and move the ball forward? Yeah. Move liberation forward.
I remember someone telling me that we need to let Harriet rest. We need to leave her alone, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, these beings don't need to rest. Like we need to rest. Like me and you need to rest, right? Because we're embodied beings, right? Who are still struggling to connect to their awakened mind, to their enlightened self, right? But these beings are awakened. Like they've transcended exhaustion.
Right.
You
They're
know,
choosing this.
yeah,
Yeah.
they've
They're making
transcended
choices.
exactly, right? And they've transcended dread and aversion, and doubt. They just do it, right? They do it,
Right.
they get it done, right? And they keep doing it over and over again, emanating into the world, taking on suffering, showing us how to do the work of liberation. When their piece of the work is done, they're out,
Yeah, they carried it. They did what they
Yeah,
could,
yeah,
and that's why I was telling you how I had these concerns about the book because
yeah,
everyone's like, Harriet needs to rest. You don't know Harriet. Harriet didn't like
exactly.
this. Harriet loves this. Harriet hates that. And I'm like, look, this is just what came through me, people. Okay, I'm just doing
Yeah,
my part. Harriet
yeah,
for sure wanted me to do this, and
yeah,
my full being, my experiences laid out in that book. I don't need to share that of
yeah.
how it happened. But yeah, there is something about these spirits and they're being amplified. I was reminded by a friend the other day we were talking about the statue of Robert E. Lee.
Mm, mhm,
And, when they were 2020, when it was all about the statue takedowns in
mhm,
Virginia, and they
yeah,
had that giant one in Harriet's face. Somebody had it, on there,
mhm,
how you can do project those images was on
mhm.
Rob for so long. It was
Wow,
like a month straight every night. And I was like, is that Harriet doing that? It was like,
right.
wow, the symbolism of that. I think I have some photos
Yeah,
of that. And I remember posting it, um, how they had her face over, projected there. And then they closed off the site, to all the
mhm,
protesters weren't allowed, now they were being threatened with
yeah,
felonies if they touched
yeah,
it and all that. But for
yeah,
a while they were going after all those images. But that also reminded me, some people got mad. And I was like, mad at that?
right.
No, this is iconic, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So
I think
please
that,
don't be
like
mad, people. Let's
yeah,
get over that. This is alive. This is a highway. These beings are moving. They're helping us.
yeah. I think, we assume that these beings have no agency. Like, we project their struggle with agency, when they were alive onto them in their death, right? And so
Mhm.
that's where we're functioning from, where, we're just using these great beings where, people are making money, blah, 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 but I think that, again, it's recognizing that these beings have way more agency than we can possibly imagine right now.
Well,
Right.
yeah,
It's
they're
just like,
powerful.
if their
Yes.
image ended up on something, they were behind it.
Right.
Like, if you're dreaming about these beings, they're behind it, right? If a movie pops up, they're behind it, right? And it's never going to be perfect because there's no such thing as perfection in the carceral state, right? It's always going to be challenges. There are always going to be things that we're not going to agree with. But the thing is to remember what they did, and we may not remember every single thing that they did, but
Mm.
we are remembering. Like, kids are exposed to Harriet,
More
right?
and more.
And
Yeah.
more and more,
More
and
and
many
more.
more, not just Harriet. Like, it's just so many beings, like, because of technology, like this access to historical memory, and data, that we can just go online and learn about Sojourner Truth, for instance, or
Yes.
whomever, Malcolm X, whomever, like, we're moved by, right? Um, and that's important. That cultural memory is important, you know. But yeah, I think the thought that just crossed my mind is that, like, people tuning into this, listening to this, they're like, this is so out there, and it does all this, and I know, like, we come from a whole community of a bunch of stuff happening. The spiritual industrial complex, right? Is like always is
Surreal.
is
Yeah.
real. Like, I always, when I think about that, I think about California. I was like, oh my God, California! Like,
It's a lot going
all
on.
all the scenes and all the practices and all the teachers and this and that, and Yeah, it is like this seems really out there, absolutely. But like for me, I just think that, you know, when you hear this, like when you hear us talking about this, what do you feel?
Yeah,
You
does it
know,
feel does it feel resonant? We know
yeah,
truth not from the mind, but let it
right.
sink in your body. Often when I talk to people about this, they they start getting goosebumps.
Hmm.
They start
Yeah,
tingling.
yeah,
And it's not you can't catch this
yeah.
with the mind. We're talking about the world of spirit here. We're talking about
Hmm.
ancestor world. And a lot of people are just waking up to that. That
Yeah,
that beings can live. We're in an interdimensional universe.
yeah,
And we're just in one place at one time. But I will
exactly.
say for me, one of the reasons these beings are back is what I got so clearly in the book process and writing and these conversations was here. It's like, my
Mhm.
work is not done.
Yeah,
These beings are opening this up.
yeah.
These beings are opening these roads through the mind.
Mhm.
And it seems to be a two-way road, right? We can access them and now they're downloading like
Mhm.
information, right? We talked about this
Mhm.
before. Like once it's open, it's like, oh, great, here you go. Here you go. Feels like a highway of
Mhm.
going in both directions, up and then down. And it's just like, there is something very powerful about this
Yeah.
because um, they're saying, "Hey, I'm not done." Harriet's like, "I'm not done. I
Mhm.
helped get us slavery abolished, but not a mindset."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now I'm back to work on that, the real liberation,
Mhm.
which makes it so connected to Dharma, so connected
Yeah.
to ancestors. So, there's something excited about the spirit underground because also it's
Mhm.
connected to our Buddhist views
Yeah.
of the cosmos on some level.
Yeah. Yeah, the liberation of the mind,
hmm
right?
This is about mind liberation now,
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah.
Most of you who are listening to this already have all the toys. You've already
Yeah.
reached a level where you've exhausted your financial
Mhm.
liberation. You've probably exhausted your,
Mhm.
the spiritual industrial complex,
Yeah.
This is going to attract people that are like, what now? Why am I
Yeah.
still, I'm free. I was let loose, but I'm not free. I
Yeah,
love that
exactly.
saying.
Mhm.
We're loose.
Mhm.
We're wandering around now,
Yeah. Yeah.
free range chickens, but we're not,
Exactly. Yeah.
but we're not liberated
Yeah.
fully. And I believe that
Yeah.
this spirit underground, pure land consciousness download can be really helpful. And I feel like for me, I feel like I'm just awakening to this. And I think
Mhm.
it will, as any road you traverse, it gets bigger, you start knowing how to drive. Maybe right
Yeah.
now I'm crawling on it, but at some point I'll be skating and then I'll be like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
here's how here's how this works.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, there's also the training that we have to choose in order to open to these
Yes.
kinds of realities. It's like we just can't stay stuck in the relative, right?
The
Believing
conventional
everything.
karmic 3D
Yeah,
level form.
exactly. Like you have to open to these truths, right? And on one hand, sure, it can be overwhelming, right? But over time, it's really not that overwhelming. It's just like, oh, this is how things are. Like there's much more happening than this moment,
Yes, there's
you
other
know?
things going on that are more than
Yeah,
us in this moment of trauma, which is like what
yeah,
we were talking about earlier, that we're
yeah,
more than our trauma.
exactly. And how do I begin to be beyond the trauma? Because samsara, the carceral state, is pervasive, right? It's like it's nuanced, it's complex, right?
Mm.
And it takes a lot of work to work through the confusion and the delusion, and a lot of people aren't doing nearly as much as they need to be doing, right? It has to be a holistic approach to the work of liberation. Again, the social work and also the spiritual work. Like if you're turned off by the spiritual, then it's going to be hard to get free.
Yes. Yeah. You're
You
relying
know,
on just you and your mind. And that's
yeah,
like
you know,
1% here,
yeah, and we want to open up to the full range of resources and experiences.
And power.
And
And
power.
support. Yes.
I'm much more than this body and this experience. I had to start training in that early on. Like there has to be more than this because this seems really rigid, and fatalistic,
Mm-hmm.
And impenetrable, But then you start thinking, well, is this it? Is this the only experience that's possible to have in this moment? And then you begin to open up and get curious, and you begin to have these experiences that are transcendent of the rigidity of the carceral state. Like you begin to experience, the oneness of everything, or God, or the mother, or the father, however you phrase that, in practice. But you touch into something that's fluid and sacred and divine and free. Once you touch
Yeah.
freedom
Yeah.
outside of this state, then like what's possible.
Yeah, it's like you open this door and you just
Yeah.
finally get fresh air for a first time in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But now you know it's there. Even if you
Yeah.
shut it, somehow it changes you by just knowing it's possible.
Yeah.
Well, you wrote something really beautiful. You sent me that message last night and you were talking about this time, where it feels like the spirit underground is also alive with all these ancestors
Yeah.
because the battle isn't over. And it feels like the buildup eerily, almost exactly to the Civil War.
Yeah.
Like renegade president taking over, saying, half the country following. I mean, it's like, whoa, all of this stuff feels like a drumbeat.
Yeah.
Very similar to 1860.
Yeah.
And splitting the country and people running off with this president and then fighting against this one. But you were saying that it's a time. What I really liked about what you texted me, you said that we're going to lose a lot of people because they won't know how to connect to this divine. So this for me is something I want you to talk about because as part of this divine connecting to this spirit underground, these beings, this light, this consciousness of freedom, and also this consciousness of this divine love, because Harriet is like, she looks fierce, panther. She was wrathful spirit, but her heart was so benevolent.
Yeah.
There was this love that always would overwhelm me. I'd be like falling on the ground crying because it was just like more than I could take of this divine energy.
Yeah.
And but when you wrote that, like, we may lose a lot of people because they won't know, they'll die or they'll kill themselves. They won't know how to connect to the divine because it's about to get escalated. It feels like the escalation. I mean, just look around right now. The Matrix is on fire.
And the question is, what's really on fire? Like I'm always thinking about
Delusion.
that. Delusion, when I talk about people being lost, I just, a lot of people won't be able to do the work. They won't have the capacity to do this intense emotional, spiritual labor, right? Of working through the trauma, connecting to their most authentic self, and trying to touch a real experience of the divine, a real experience of liberation, right? So many people who are lost in, these kind of politics, of, particularly make America great. Like, there's an unwillingness to let go of identity, right? The rigidity of identity, and to expand into our true natures of who and what we are. And when we start doing that, we want people to be free and happy. Like we don't want to subjugate and silence and enslave people. We want people to live their best life because we're beginning to live our best life. So when people are trying to like work for, the control of reproductive rights, and ending civil liberties and so much more. Like they're trying to express their own suffering in the world because that's the only way they know how to deal with it is to make everyone else, suffer in the way that they're suffering,
Right.
and to also erase how people are showing them to be free because they aren't interested in freedom because of the
Yeah.
responsibility of being free. Right. And then,
Mm.
that goes back to Harriet, because not everyone wanted to leave the plantation.
That's
There was,
right. I mean, it was hard work to leave. First of all, it's
yeah,
hard. You have to be willing to
yeah,
go into the unknown. I mean, even when I was writing the book, I wanted to turn around a bunch of times. And Eric used to be like, look, we're on the Spirit Underground. We're on the Underground Light Rail. And you trying to turn around? No. And I would have to look. And that was, Lama Rod, that was the hardest part of that work is all of the buttons of trauma that were pushed, not necessarily through working with Harriet, but through the research, the study, the intensity, all my own unresolved pieces. That was what was so hard, laughing, crying, processing. I think that was the gift of it being over was I could stop doing that deep trauma work for that whole time. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to kill over. I can't. I can't. I'm done. And I'm good for it. I'll go in there. I'll fight the good fight with it. I'm not shying away from the grief, but it was extra.
Yeah.
I mean, it was accelerated. I mean, she was like, you're going on this light rail and by all means necessary and all this stuff just needs to get purified. And I was hanging on by my fingernails and, there was nothing to hang on to actually. It was just go and just be and process and feel and move and do it for all
and
beings and do it as a conductor.
Yeah. Yeah. Letting go.
Yeah, letting go of all these tangles.
Yeah.
And our collective trauma, our Black history, the trauma of the sorrows of that, And I think so many of us have been tripped up in that over the last 2 years. We got the biggest button in the universe got pressed. In May of 2020, there was a crack after George Floyd's murder and all the other murder. There was a kind of, as we know. But I'm hoping, my prayers are that our work, for a lot of people, they'll be able to understand what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And they'll already have felt it, but they didn't have the language.
Yeah.
And
the work, I think, for me is understanding that I am not my trauma. That trauma is an experience, and we've self-identified.
We're too attached, right?
Too attached, too self-identified with the experiences that actually keep us bound in the carceral state. And we have to start shifting the flow of that energy, not away from self-identification, like with the suffering, and more into who I am beyond the suffering. So like choosing joy, gratitude, happiness, community and belonging, beginning to identify essentially with the spaciousness instead of the constrictions and the rigidity.
And your thoughts were when you were sending the text and some of your recent writings, you were saying those who can't make it will choose to check out. They'll, or something,
Well, I don't think it's necessarily going to be conscious checking out.
Right,
I just think
absolutely.
when I think about people not making it, I just think that there's just going to be these, well, it already is this kind of alternate reality that we'll slide into, and we'll lose the capacity to communicate across these realities. I'm thinking about it as higher and lower frequencies as well. Like people are choosing the lower frequencies because that's what they know. And they think that this is what that's all there is, right? And then there are those of us who are choosing these higher frequencies, these higher vibrations, right? They're taking us more into light, more into clarity, more into the love, more closer to God, the mother, into the essence, the Buddha
Yes.
nature,
Spirit.
like to that awakening out of the carceral state. And this is the sinister work of the carceral state, that it becomes irresistible. Like it becomes the snake charming us. Like we
And
think
can you say
we're the
more
snake.
about carceral? Just
Yeah,
for
carceral,
people who
like
might
just
not
like we
know
talk
that
about,
term.
yeah, we talk about carceral as in terms of, is aligned with the prison industrial complex, right? But we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about what it means to be captive, what it means to be
Mm.
bound. What does it mean to be enclosed? You know, how how we use you know the carceral state to solve problems, right? How
Mm-hmm.
we've become reliant, particularly on the prison, system
Mm-hmm.
to do this work, when instead this work is work that communities should be doing through restorative justice, through the liberation practices of dreaming, and working towards a different future where we're holding people in love, not getting rid of people, right?
Right.
Where systems that promote, violence and domination are disrupted, are abolished. Like we're abolishing the systems that are defining or informing how we show up in relationships. We're becoming fugitives, right? Like that kind of fugitivity where
Mm.
it's like, what, I'm leaving this, right? And there are
Right.
consequences to leaving systems, right? And states, right? And institutions, you know? How do I choose love over the hate or the
Yes,
aversion?
yeah. And also, I realized I was teaching last night at Spirit Rock on Monday night, the Monday night Sangha, which has been going on for so long, since the beginning. It's kind of their main Sangha. And I was talking so much about metta. And I just felt a whole wave of the importance of this energy of this love divine. And I was
Yeah,
really feeling it. You know how when you're teaching and you
yeah,
get like just this real open channel comes on and
yeah,
it ignites you in a way,
yeah,
when you're sitting in front, it's kind of like you open a door of this really beautiful flow of
yeah,
energy. Is what feels so beautiful about sharing the Dharma and sharing wisdom.
yeah.
Um, and it came to me as I was sitting there that, we're going to have to develop such a more thick skin. I wanted to write a post the other day online that said, everybody get used to the N word. It's about to blow up. And if we're
Yeah,
still reacting to it,
yeah,
like it's brutal, it's going to hurt.
yeah,
But we have to actually find another place with that. Like it's
yeah,
only going to affect our trauma,
yeah,
you know? And I just started to feel like, oh no, this word, I just feel like it's
yeah.
rising in a whole different level
Absolutely.
out of the
Yeah,
underworld.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
okay, this is about to be real commonplace and completely normalized again. And
Mhm,
like, wow, but are we going to react to every single person? Or are we going to try to find this
mhm.
power? And I think about how many times Harriet was called down. I was like, well, whatever, keep on going,
Yeah, and
you
and
know?
I mean, you can call me whatever you want, but that's not what I am, and
Exactly.
that's the importance of self-love there, because self-love
Mm.
actually is about the ways in which I'm beginning to see myself as an awakened being, or as someone who deserves to be happy and well and safe, and have access to resources. like self-love is also what disrupts our self-identification with the trauma. So
Yes.
people roll up on you, they're like, well, you're this and that, as we say in the South, calling people out of their names, you
Mm.
know. Um,
There's gonna be a
and
lot of
you'll
that,
look,
I feel like.
and you look and you're like, well, that's not who I am. Like, I don't understand that. And that's a way that people, it's kind of like magic. That's a way that people exert power over us.
Exactly. By that
Is when
trauma.
that trauma, like people know how to trigger us. They know
Oh,
where we
yeah.
collapse, right? And you start taking those triggers away through cultivating self-love, like just
Yes.
deep acceptance and understanding of who you are. And so you begin to see that when people are hurling that language towards you, it's just an expression of their own misery, their own sorrow, right? And it has like, I don't have to get involved in that reactivity to their suffering. What I am called to do, however, is to return that violence with compassion, right? And that compassion just meaning that, like, yeah, I get it. Like, you're hurting,
Right.
right? And you see me as the source of that hurt, but I won't take that work on for you. I will not become the reason you're hurting. Like, you have to do the work of understanding that, and taking care of
Yes.
that, and calling in the resources that you need, community, whatever it is. But like I will not be erased because you don't know how to hold your pain without reacting to it.
Exactly.
And that's
Yes.
the war. Like, I'm not going anywhere
Mhm. Yeah,
anymore.
we stand our ground, right? This is
Like,
how it
that's it.
ends. Just like Harriet stood her
Yeah.
ground,
Yeah. It's
you
just like,
know?
yeah. Like, you don't have power over me anymore.
Yeah. But
Like
we've
in
allowed
the
a lot to be
yeah.
ourselves to be disempowered a
Yeah.
lot, right? In certain,
Yeah.
we overreact, we give all our power away, we fight,
Yeah.
and maybe it's good, but sometimes it's not worth
Yeah.
you know,
You
the bigger
know,
picture.
it's just so much suffering, and I see people, you know, um, who are just so afraid of being themselves that they would rather erase and annihilate people who are reminding them of what they could possibly be instead of actually becoming who they truly authentically are, you know? Like, and it's heartbreaking, but I think for me at least, I'm at this point where it's like, you're not gonna annihilate me anymore because my ancestors refuse to allow me to be annihilated. Like, we've worked too hard now to get to this
Absolutely.
moment, and
Exactly.
what civil war arises is gonna be people who are just saying, you know what, this is enough.
Mhm.
Like, you're not gonna roll in and do whatever you want,
Mhm.
as this expression of historical trauma, from
Mhm.
one dominant culture to another. I think that people are like, no, this is enough. Like, we deserve to be here. We have a right to be here, right? And by, of course, in terms of Malcolm X, like, by any means necessary, we will be surviving.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
I live here, in Atlanta, right? And so, like, I feel that energy. I feel Black
Yeah.
people like, you know what,
Yeah, there's
we're
definitely
not going anywhere.
there's a stronghold in Atlanta. I feel like Atlanta is like the front line, and
you
it
know,
feels like it is the front line of some kind of energy there.
yeah,
Oakland used to carry a lot. I feel like it's
hmm
dwindling, and it's all moved to Atlanta. Some kind of
hmm
portal is now there, and
hmm
and maybe that's more of the Spirit Underground energy.
yeah,
Dr. King's home place. We have all these amazing people throughout the South that are.
yeah,
The South is awakening
yeah,
because it
you
has to
know,
be. The South has to stand up now. Yeah,
yeah,
the South is gonna have
yeah.
to fight.
And energetically, there's still so much trauma in the land, from
Yes.
the genocide and the removal, of indigenous community, the Cherokee, Muskogee, and the Creek communities here, right? And there's that trauma. There's the trauma of slavery. There's the trauma of Civil War. There's the trauma of Jim Crow. There's the trauma of lynching. There's the trauma of systematic anti-Blackness, and and all that's still present. And I think that this is the time that we have to start disrupting and releasing that trauma. This is why I focus so much on the land. This is why I'm sitting so much, with the indigenous elders in the spirit world, right? This is why I'm connecting to my ancestors. This is why I'm here, right? Like, this is the work, right? Because what's happening in the material world has a reflection and a root in the spirit world, right? And the unseen energy realms, right? And so we have to be as concerned with the unseen world as we are with the seen world. And so when I see the struggles that we're going through right now, I have to examine the energetic root, the unseen roots of this work. And this is, I think, the work of shamans historically, and medicine people and healers, and energy workers, is for us to get to the roots of these things that are creating these impacts in the material seen world.
Absolutely.
And then it takes a lot of healing and reconciliation and individual responsibility. Like, I have to first and foremost take responsibility for my suffering and my trauma, right?
Yeah.
Like, I have to do that. I have to make that choice in order to join my work with the collective.
Yeah, it feels like if we're not willing to tend to ourselves and do this healing work and take care of our emotions and let go of our traumatic identities, for lack of a better word. Our identity is as the victim, and not victim, I don't want to use that word because that's a loaded word, but
right.
It's just the identification with just being a suffering being instead of seeing our Buddha nature, instead of seeing us the way the gods, the God self, our highest self, our light being self. And so I'm excited about this time in this moments with all the complexity and uncertainty in politics and battles and the build up to something epic here. I mean, something's going to happen in the next couple of years. Something's happening in the next couple of weeks.
It may be happening today.
Yeah, it could happen today. It could happen tomorrow.
Anytime.
Anytime.
Like, you have
it's just uncertain.
It's like what the ancestors talk about. They always talk about this with me, but like, this refers to the Bible around like how Jesus will come like a thief in the night. And I forget where that passage is, but we'll put that in the episode notes. But that urgency, that kind of like, yes, this will happen at any point, and we have to be ready.
Right.
Like, we have to be ready at any time. That's the training, to be ready. And I think that's the training in meditation and Dharma, is just to be ready to show up to the moment, right? And everyone, so many people come to me, they're like, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What happens if this thing happens and that law gets passed and this and that for, and so forth and so on. I tell people that, like, me and my ancestors will deal with what arises when it arises.
Right. And you are like that. You can hold all this like LGBT, then this thing with Black men, this thing that you do have this ability to just like, you have a kind of calm centeredness while everyone is going into worry. You do have that ability.
And that's, I rely on my ancestors for that. It's like, when you're connected to your ancestors, you have this incredible capacity to have a sense of so much more that's happening around you, right? And I benefit from the struggle, the insight, the fierceness of my ancestors who survived so much so that I could be here. So to be, again, attuned to them is to actually also receive this intense confidence, right?
Yes.
It says that, like, you're not alone.
Yes, you're
Like you
not
have
alone. We're
all
here.
these beings with you who are also, I think I have really powerful ancestors, right?
I think so.
And
Your family is pretty epic. Your mom's a
yeah,
preacher. I
yeah,
mean, you come from a line of like very
yeah,
powerful, vocal,
yeah.
fearless to be
Fearless,
preaching and standing
hmm
up and speaking out. And
yeah.
yeah, that
We
you
come
you
from,
have that. Mhm.
yeah, a lot of Black prophetic energy, in
Yes.
my family, but also that fierceness. Like it's like whatever happens, we're gonna deal with it.
Yes, and we will deal
We
with
would deal
it.
with it.
We've dealt
You
with
know,
it.
yeah, we,
Harriet dealt with
yeah.
this. There's nothing new here. Harriet's like,
It's
nothing new
nothing
is
new.
happening here. I've
It's
seen
just the
this.
same old stuff.
So let's talk
History
about
repeats itself.
practices. Yeah,
Yeah.
history is repeating itself. So what do we say to
hmm
people who say, how do I practice the spirit underground work? So I want to
hmm
just give them some ideas. So, from my perspective,
Yeah.
this idea of connecting to your ancestors in a really deep way right now. We need to call
hmm
on them. We need to open the gates. Um, and then
Yeah.
also these
Yeah.
meditation practices. And then plant medicine has been so helpful for
Yeah.
us to deal. And the reason
Exactly.
I work with plant medicine is the traumas, those big, huge traumas. I mean, that's when
Yeah.
I first started working with it. And we talked
Yeah.
about your first journey with Lotus Vine and not the collective trauma of the Middle
Yeah.
Passage. But
hmm
this is why I want to share it, because I feel like it's a way, everybody,
Yeah.
you can move faster. I mean,
Yeah.
Lord knows it could take a long time to get down to this DNA
hmm
level.
hmm
So I just want to just help people make sense of, how do we do these
Yeah.
practices? What are the
Yeah.
liberation practices? How do we
Yeah.
connect people?
Yeah. And I often, teach these days a kind of like an energetic connection to beings who have deeply inspired our work of liberation. Of
Hmm.
course, Harriet, of course, being
Yes.
primary here in our work right now. Like, how do you just consciously connect to their consciousness? Like, how do I just open up and receive the downloads from these massive awakened consciousness is? I don't know what the plural of consciousness is, but like, how do we remember the people who did this work before us and
Hmm.
what they went through? Like, how can we open up to their, I don't know, fearlessness, right?
Absolutely.
To the
Courage.
courage. Like you, once you really, really, really sit with what these folks did, like
Hmm.
then you've had, this opportunity to kind of, for Harriet to like bring you along on what it
Yes.
meant to escape, the experience of escaping, leaving
Hmm.
plantation. Like we have to journey back to these experiences and learn how to relive them in our imaginations, with or without plant medicine, right? But we can just go back and say, what was this like? you know, and
Hmm.
what, you know, and how do I see similarities in my own life? What is it that I should be leaving and running away from that I can't even fathom doing? Like, what is that? You know? And you start getting a sense of what these folks were doing and the choices that they made. So that's an important practice. I can't show it on the camera because all the stuff is on the other side of the room, but I have like pictures, of all the beings that are inspiring my work right now.
Oh.
From, of course, Harriet Tubman to like Audre Lorde to Essex Hemphill. Who else is on it? Bell Hooks, Samuel Delaney, um, Sweet Honey and the Rock, so forth and so on. Lots of people. And I have those pictures up, right? And I want people to do that. I want you to surround yourself with images of people who remind you about freedom and liberation and the work
Yes.
that it takes, right? I want you to wear the clothing, with the images of these beings. I have, hoodies with,
Harriet
of course,
Tubman
Harriet
hoodies.
Tubman. I have a James Baldwin hoodie. I have an Audre Lorde hoodie as well. And so, like, reminding yourself that these great beings are came before us. The great beings are still here. Like, absolutely. Like, I don't want to be misunderstood to say, well, there's no one doing great work. There's a lot of beings doing great work, and you can find those beings and support them and learn from them as well.
Absolutely. And these are ways that we can fortify ourselves to connect. And I think the more people we start talking about this, the better. The more we we're going to have to unite here. Uniting is a big one. And stop spending all the time picking each other apart and just say, hey, we're in this together. So I think we're going to come to a close on this episode of The Spirit Underground. And I give thanks